the night of February 2nd, 1502. The air inside the Duchy of Ferrara hung heavy, soaked with the scent of wine, incense, and expectation. In a golden chamber watched by official witnesses, a 21-year-old woman lay on the marriage bed. Her name was Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of the Pope, and now wife to Alfonso d'Este, heir to one of Italy's oldest and proudest dynasties. But this was not a night of love. It was a transaction, a political ritual disguised as passion, and its final act had to be proven. That night, before the eyes of history, Lucrezia Borgia was consummated not once, not twice, but 3 times. A brutal test of fertility, the public sealing of an alliance her family needed to survive. For centuries, her name has carried the stench of poison, incest, and sin. She has been painted as the angel-faced demon of the Renaissance. But what if the truth was darker? What if the real monstrosity was never Lucrezia herself, but the men who owned her body, her future, and her soul? Because this is not just the story of a scandalous marriage, it's the story of how power used a woman to build an empire. To understand the night Lucrezia Borgia was offered like a trophy to Ferrara, we must first understand the world that created her, a world built on deceit, blood, and divine ambition. In the closing years of the 15th century, Italy was not a country, but a battlefield carved into fragments of pride. Each city-state, Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, Rome, was a kingdom unto itself, a chessboard ruled by dukes, mercenaries, and popes who wielded religion like a weapon. And in the center of that chaos sat the Vatican, the throne of St. Peter, where salvation and sin were traded at the same price. It was here that the most cunning man of his age, Rodrigo Borgia, seized power and remade faith into dynasty. In 1492, the year Columbus crossed the ocean, Rodrigo crowned himself Pope Alexander VI, and the Holy See became the stage for the most dangerous family drama in Europe. For Alexander, holiness was merely a costume draped over hunger. He saw the papacy not as a calling from God, but as the ultimate prize, a means to raise his children into sovereigns who would rule through manipulation, gold, and fear. He had no royal lineage, no inherited armies, no divine right. What he had was sharper, intelligence that cut like steel, and children who would serve as the hands of his ambition. He forged them into extensions of himself, generals, diplomats, seducers. The Borgias would not conquer by faith alone. They would conquer by turning blood into currency. And at the heart of his grand design stood 2 luminous creatures, his son, Cesare Borgia, and his daughter, Lucrezia. Cesare was the blade of the family, the kind of man who smiled while plotting the death of kingdoms. Once ordained as a cardinal, he despised the cassock that bound him to God. He longed not for prayers but for conquest. His mind was that of a strategist, his heart that of a predator. He believed Italy could be united only through fear and steel, and he meant to wield both. When he rode into battle, he did not fight for Rome or for Christ, but for the rising empire of the Borgias, an empire that had no altar but power itself. And in his shadow, like the reflection of a blade in sunlight, stood Lucrezia, the golden pawn, radiant, educated, and dangerously useful. She was beauty fashioned into strategy. Trained in Latin, Greek, Italian, and French, she moved through the courts of Europe like music disguised as diplomacy. Men saw her as an ornament, her father saw her as a key. In the market of Renaissance politics, a daughter's purity was a weapon more valuable than an army. To the Pope, Lucrezia was not a child but an asset, a coin minted in innocence, meant to buy alliances and silence enemies. Imagine being 13 years old, and the most powerful man in the world looks at you not with paternal affection, but with calculation. Your body, your future, your soul, all weighed and measured against the ambitions of others. Love had no language in her house. There was only utility. At 13, Lucrezia was married to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, nearly twice her age. The wedding was a spectacle of power, a celebration that bathed Rome in gold and feasts. The Pope had secured his northern flank. The alliance with the Sforza family promised stability in a land of shifting loyalties. For 4 years, Lucrezia played the role she was given, the gentle wife, the political symbol, the living promise of peace. Yet, in the world of the Borgias, alliances aged like milk in the sun. By the time Lucrezia reached 17, her father no longer needed the Sforzas. They were expendable, their usefulness evaporated. And so, the girl who had been a bride became once again a bargaining chip waiting to be reassigned. The papacy had taught Rodrigo Borgia that a throne is safest when someone else bleeds for it. And so began the quiet destruction of Giovanni Sforza. Divorce would have been too ordinary, too polite for the Pope of Machiavellian Rome. Instead, he unleashed a weapon deadlier than poison: humiliation. He declared before Christendom that Giovanni was impotent, that his marriage to Lucrezia had never been consummated. In one stroke he erased the man's honor and the alliance that bound him. Sforza, enraged and disgraced, struck back with a rumor so vile it would stain Lucrezia forever. The whisper that she was not only the Pope's daughter but his lover, that Caesare too desired what no brother should. It was a lie born from vengeance, but one so fitting to the family's reputation that the world embraced it as truth. And thus, the legend of the Borgia sins began to take its monstrous shape. The rumor of incest spread like wildfire through the marble corridors of Europe, staining Lucrezia's name before she even understood what reputation meant. It was not merely gossip, it was a weapon, one sharper than any dagger her brother might wield. Giovanni Sforza, humiliated and stripped of power, had chosen to destroy his young wife not through battle but through words that could not be unsaid. His vengeance found an audience eager for scandal. The Borgias had made too many enemies, and in the whispers of perversion and sin, their rivals found vindication. Lucrezia, barely 17, was declared Virgo intacta by the papal court, an absurd performance staged to legally annul her marriage. The entire world knew it was a lie, but in the theater of power, truth was irrelevant. Her husband was ruined, her father triumphant, and she still a child, was returned to Rome as a pawn that could be played again. Yet something had changed in her eyes. The girl who once obeyed without question had begun to understand the brutality of the game she was born into. In Rome, beneath frescoes painted to glorify saints and martyrs, Lucrezia learned what it meant to survive among wolves. She had been used as a token once. She knew she would be used again. Her brother Caesare, now freed from his robes of priesthood, had become the most feared commander in Italy. His military campaigns were carving new territories, and his ambitions reached as far as his sword could strike. The Borgia Empire was expanding, and new alliances were required to keep it intact. Lucrezia was no longer seen as a girl disgraced by rumor, but as a political instrument to be reforged. And so, barely healed from one public humiliation, she was promised again, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisegli, a young nobleman whose bloodline connected her to the powerful kingdom of Naples. The arrangement was meant to seal peace in the south, but destiny, for once, chose to intervene with something the Borgias never accounted for: love. Alfonso was not like the men who had used her name for profit. He was gentle, handsome, and unafraid to look at Lucrezia not as property, but as person. Against all expectations, affection bloomed between them. For the first time in her life, Lucrezia experienced something that resembled happiness. Their union, though arranged, became real. They shared laughter within the marble walls of the Vatican, and soon after, a son was born, Rodrigo, named for her father. It was a brief season of light in a lifetime built on shadows, and perhaps the only time she felt that she might escape the curse of her lineage. For once, the pawn had become something else, a woman with her own will, a wife and mother who could imagine a future not written by men in robes or armor. But in the world of the Borgias, love was a luxury too costly to last, and every luxury was paid for in blood. As Caesare's ambitions swelled, so did the tension between his empire and the Aragonese bloodline of Lucrezia's husband. The Duke of Biseglie represented old alliances that no longer served the new order. France had become Caesare's chosen partner, and France was the sworn enemy of Naples. Politics turned love into liability. Alfonso's very existence became an inconvenience, a reminder of the past that threatened the future Caesare was building. In the heat of a Roman summer, the inevitable happened. One night in 1500, as Alfonso climbed the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, assassins emerged from the shadows. Blades flashed, blood ran across the stone, and the young duke collapsed under the weight of treachery. Yet fate refused to grant him the mercy of death. Broken and bleeding, Alfonso was carried by loyal servants into the Vatican itself, where Lucrezia, trembling yet defiant, took charge of his care. She turned her chambers into a sanctuary, locking the doors, refusing entry to anyone she did not trust. Day and night she nursed her husband, tasting every bite of his food, fearing poison in every drop of wine, sleeping beside him as if her presence alone could ward off death. But even love cannot withstand the will of power. A month later, as Alfonso slowly recovered, Cesare's right hand, the merciless Michelotto Corella, stormed into the room with soldiers. Lucrezia's cries were drowned in the struggle that followed. Alfonso, too weak to fight, was seized by the throat and strangled in his own bed. When it was done, the killers left in silence, and Cesare walked the Vatican halls as though nothing had happened, remarking coldly, "What is not done at dinner is finished by supper." For Lucrezia, that sentence ended the last illusion of safety. Her heart broke not in grief alone, but in comprehension. She finally understood that her family's affection was a mask for domination. In the game of the Borgias, even love was an expendable piece. Her husband's death was not merely murder, it was initiation. That night, the last remnants of her innocence died beside him. And when her father sent her away to a convent to mourn, it was not an act of mercy, it was strategy. Out of sight meant out of scandal. Rome would forget, and the machine would prepare her once again for another move on the board. In the dim silence of the convent walls, Lucrezia Borgia's world finally stopped spinning. For months she lived between prayer and memory, haunted by the echo of her husband's strangled breath and the indifference with which her brother had erased her happiness. Yet even in grief, the machinery of power did not rest. The convent was not her refuge, it was her quarantine, a waiting room where she could be purified of scandal before being sent again into the service of her family's ambition. The Borgias were collapsing under the weight of their own brilliance. Enemies gathered like vultures around Rome, whispering of rebellion and retribution. Pope Alexander VI understood that survival required a new alliance, one grand enough to restore the family's legitimacy. And so, for the third time, Lucrezia was chosen to be the bridge between kingdoms, the living treaty between faith and fear. Her next marriage would have to be her greatest performance, a union that would silence every rumor, erase every sin, and secure a dynasty's fading glory. The chosen target was Ferrara, a duchy known not for brute force, but for refinement, intellect, and lineage. Its ruler, Duke Ercole d'Este, was a man of ancient blood, proud and cautious, who regarded the Borgias with visible disgust. To him, the daughter of a pope, twice married and shadowed by whispers of incest and murder, was a threat to his family's honor. The very idea of joining his noble house to such infamy felt like desecration. But the Borgias had learned that morality bends before gold and fear. Pope Alexander VI offered the d'Este family a dowry so immense that it could finance an army. He promised papal favor, indulgences, and political protection from the tides of war that were sweeping Italy. And behind those honeyed words stood Cesare's soldiers, camped on Ferrara's borders, waiting for an excuse to march. In that suffocating combination of temptation and threat, the Duke's resistance crumbled. The engagement was sealed. The heir to Ferrara, Alfonso d'Este, would marry Lucrezia Borgia, and the world would once again witness the most infamous name in Europe ascend to power. For Lucrezia, the announcement was both deliverance and doom. She knew what was expected of her: charm them, please them, and above all, prove her worth. Her body had become the theater of politics, her womb the altar on which her family's salvation would be offered. As the wedding day approached, she moved like an actress rehearsing her lines, masking fear with poise, heartbreak with serenity. February of 1502 arrived with the heavy perfume of incense and ambition. In Ferrara, the court glittered with candlelight, and beyond the walls, crowds whispered of the Borgia bride who came with more gold than innocence. Inside the ducal palace, Lucrezia stood beneath gilded ceilings, her gown a masterpiece of Venetian silk, her expression carved from restraint. Every glance, every breath was being measured. Failure was unthinkable, weakness fatal. She understood that her survival now depended on performance, and the act would not end until morning. That night, as the ceremony concluded and the witnesses gathered, the final ritual began. The consummation of marriage in noble houses was more than intimacy, it was verification. The world demanded proof that the alliance was sealed, that the bride was fertile, that her family had delivered what it promised. And so, before the eyes of servants, attendants, and the ever-watchful chroniclers of scandal, the daughter of the Pope was stripped not of clothing, but of privacy. The act was recorded, witnessed, repeated. Once, twice, thrice. What her enemies later described as lust was, in truth, an ordeal, A public examination meant to erase doubt and secure Ferrara's loyalty. It was humiliation masked as duty, cruelty disguised as formality. Yet Lucrezia endured it without a tremor. The woman who had once been broken by loss now wore endurance as armor. The triple consummation was not her surrender, it was her passage. In that moment, beneath the golden light and the suffocating weight of expectation, she crossed a threshold from pawn to survivor. And when dawn broke over Ferrara, the world saw what it wanted to see: a compliant duchess, the obedient daughter of a pope, the living proof of alliance. But beneath the surface, something irrevocable had changed. Lucrezia's submission was no longer the product of fear, but of calculation. She had learned the rules of the board too well to play blindly. She understood that her body, her grace, her silence, all were tools, and she would wield them as the men of her family had wielded swords. To them, she had been a symbol. To herself, she was becoming something far more dangerous, a woman who understood the cost of obedience and the value of endurance. The night that branded her in history as an object of scandal was, in truth, the night she began to forge her independence. From the ashes of humiliation, Lucrezia Borgia began to rise, not as the temptress her enemies imagined, but as the strategist her lineage demanded. She had paid the price of obedience in full, and now she intended to collect its reward. When Lucrezia entered Ferrara as its new duchess, she crossed more than a border. She stepped into a new existence where her name no longer had to echo beneath the shadow of her father or her brother. Ferrara was not Rome. Its court prized intellect and elegance over manipulation, art over deceit, refinement over terror. For the first time in her life, Lucrezia breathed air that was not thick with schemes. Though her marriage to Alfonso d'Este had begun as a political exchange, it slowly transformed into a coexistence of mutual respect. The court that had once eyed her with suspicion began to admire her composure, her education, her quiet grace that carried a kind of wounded wisdom. The people whispered of her beauty, but they soon came to speak of her intelligence, her ability to command affection without force, and her talent for turning hostility into loyalty. In the glittering halls of Ferrara, where poets and philosophers gathered under candlelight, Lucrezia built a reputation that eclipsed the grotesque legends tied to her name. Away from Rome's poisonous politics, she began to reshape her image not through words, but through creation. She invited musicians, painters, and scholars to her court, transforming Ferrara into a sanctuary of the arts. Her salons became places where ideas breathed freely, untouched by the venom of papal intrigue. She learned to rule not through fear, as Caesar had, but through charm and intelligence. Her husband, initially cautious, grew to trust her judgment and rely on her diplomatic instincts. She became a bridge between courts, mediating disputes, soothing tensions, and ensuring that Ferrara remained a haven of stability amid the chaos of Italy's warring states. The same grace that had once been exploited now became her shield and her strength. She no longer needed to survive by obedience alone. She had learned to lead by subtlety, by understanding the hearts of those around her better than they understood their own. But even as Ferrara flourished under her influence, the great house of Borgia began to crumble. In 5003, her father, Pope Alexander VI, the architect of her destiny, succumbed to illness. Some said malaria, others whispered poison. His death was the first crack in the empire he had built with deception and devotion. Without the shield of papal authority, Caesare's dominion began to collapse, like a cathedral built on sand. Allies abandoned him, enemies multiplied, and the name that had once terrified Italy now became a curse. As the Vatican turned against the memory of Alexander's reign, the Borgias were hunted by their own legacy. Lucrezia, safely distant in Ferrara, could only watch from afar as the storm consumed everything that had defined her childhood. Her father's death was not merely a personal loss, it was liberation wrapped in mourning. For the first time, she was no longer anyone's bargaining chip, no one's pawn. Yet, freedom, she discovered, comes with its own loneliness. News of Caesare's downfall reached her like a phantom whisper through the marble corridors of her palace. Once a prince of the church, then a warlord feared across Italy, he was reduced to a fugitive. He was captured, escaped, and finally met his end. Not in a grand battle, but in a petty skirmish on foreign soil, bleeding into the dust of Spain. The sword of the Borgias was broken. And so, with the death of her brother and father, The dynasty that had devoured Europe's attention for a generation disintegrated into myth. Yet amidst that ruin, one Borgia survived, not by conquering, but by enduring. Lucrezia's survival became her quiet rebellion. She governed Ferrara in her husband's absence, balanced accounts, negotiated treaties, and managed estates with prudence and mercy. She proved that she was not the monster her enemies imagined, nor the puppet her family had designed. The city loved her not for her name, but for her humanity. The scandalous bride had become a sovereign in all but title. Still, beneath the elegance of Ferrara's golden evenings, she carried the ghosts of Rome. Every festival, every song of praise, was haunted by the memory of what she had endured to reach this peace. Perhaps she understood that redemption in her world was not innocence restored, but strength born from pain. The same world that once mocked her as a harlot of politics now sent envoys seeking her counsel. She had outlived the men who had shaped her fate, and by doing so, rewritten her legacy. And as she walked through the courtyards of her palace, hearing the distant laughter of her children and the murmurs of poets who wrote verses in her honor, she must have known that history would still twist her story. But she no longer needed to fight it. Her survival itself was defiance enough. As the years drifted quietly through the marble halls of Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia transformed from scandal into serenity. The woman who had once been passed from man to man as a living treaty now reigned in her own right, not through decree or fear, but through presence. Her grace had become legend, her intelligence undeniable. She had turned the weapons once used against her, beauty, charm, lineage, into the tools of survival and, eventually, respect. To her people, she was no longer the daughter of corruption, but the duchess who ruled with patience and understanding. The same court that had once whispered that her touch carried poison now praised her compassion and mourned her sorrows. Yet, beneath the calm surface of her rule, she remained haunted by the ghosts of a youth spent in the service of power. She had outlived her father, the man who had seen her as a pawn, and her brother, the man who had turned affection into control, but she could never escape the truth that she had been forged by them. Every act of kindness she offered carried the echo of the cruelty that had once surrounded her, as though she were forever trying to redeem the sins of her family through gentleness. Ferrara flourished under her guidance. The arts blossomed, scholars found refuge, and musicians gave life to the silent corridors of her palace. The duchy became known as a beacon of Renaissance brilliance, a place where culture thrived even as war and ambition consumed the rest of Italy. When Alfonso rode to battle or traveled to other courts, it was Lucrezia who held the reins of governance, balancing justice and mercy with a steady hand. She ruled as she had once survived, quietly, gracefully, and with an unspoken understanding of how fragile power truly was. The same woman who had once been displayed for the pleasure of political witnesses now presided over poets and painters who immortalized her name, not as an object of scandal, but as a muse. Her story, once written by men in whispers of sin, was being rewritten in brushstrokes of reverence and admiration. But fate, ever consistent in its cruelty, did not allow her peace to last forever. By the time she reached her late 30s, the years of loss, childbirth, and silent endurance had worn her thin. In 1509, after giving birth to her last child, she fell ill with a fever that her physicians could not cure. For days, the court of Ferrara held its breath as prayers rose from every church and chapel. The woman who had survived betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak lay still, her body surrendering to the one enemy she could not outmaneuver: time. On June 24th, at the age of 39, Lucrezia Borgia drew her final breath. Her husband mourned deeply, her subjects wept, and even her enemies, who had once cursed her name, spoke of her with reluctant respect. In the quiet that followed her death, Ferrara lost not only a duchess, but the heart that had given it grace. The daughter of a pope, once condemned as the embodiment of sin, had died as a woman beloved by her people. Her legacy, however, refused to rest in peace. The centuries that followed twisted her memory into legend. Some called her a temptress, others a saint. Artists painted her as both angel and demon. Historians debated her guilt and innocence, and writers filled libraries with contradictions. But behind all the exaggerations and myths, a single truth endured. Lucrezia Borgia had lived as few women of her time ever could. She had been used, discarded, and condemned, Yet she had turned her suffering into strength. She had learned to play the game that was designed to destroy her, and, in doing so, outlasted the men who had thought her powerless. The Golden Pawn, as history remembered her, had found a way to move across the board until she stood as queen in her own quiet realm. Perhaps that is why her story still captivates the modern world, not because of the poison or the rumors of sin, but because it is the story of transformation. It is the journey of a woman who was taught to obey yet learned to command, who was stripped of freedom yet discovered power within restraint. Her life was not a tragedy, though it was filled with sorrow. It was a demonstration of endurance, of the ability to survive when survival itself seemed impossible. And as her name echoes through time, shimmering between truth and legend, she stands as proof that even in the darkest games of history, there are those who find a way to rewrite their fate. So, the next time you hear the name Lucrezia Borgia, do not think only of scandal or seduction. Think of the girl who became a weapon, the woman who became a ruler, and the soul who refused to be forgotten. Her story is not a tale of sin. It is a testament to resilience. If you've journeyed this far into her world of power, passion, and survival, then remember to like this video, share it with those who love untold history, and subscribe for more hidden stories that reveal the human heart behind the legend. Because in the end, it is not the powerful who endure. It is the survivors who become immortal.